Well, 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 would you look at the time? That's right.
It's time to duel!
But in all seriousness, I am your boy, Snake of the Skies, and it is time for another review, my lads. It's been, about a month since my last review? Roughly that, and trust me, it's not been for lack of trying. Well, not necessarily, at least. Firstly, there have been very few major releases up until now, or at least ones that I am able to access, and I've also been rather busy with exams and some of assignments. Still being in school is a meme and all, so yeah. However, all of that changes today, for with me I have a review of the newest Ancient Bards album, Origine, also known as the Black Crystal Sword Saga Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. Ancient Bards are a symphonic power metal band from Italy, and if that doesn't tell you enough about their sound on its own, then I'll just outright say that their sound is relatively similar to Rhapsody's. The band formed in 2006, I believe, and released their debut album in 2010, and have been fairly popular ever since. This is their fourth full-length album, and is also a cool-as-heck concept album, which ties into their first three albums, which are also all concept albums. Told you they were pretty similar to Rhapsody. Either way, the overarching context is that the saga of albums are primarily connected through the focal point known as the Black Crystal Sword, though in this album it is primarily referred to as the White Crystal Sword, at least at the end, since this one is the first in a series of prequels, which means there is more to be had of this specific storyline, so that's fun. The story takes place much before the first three albums, before the sword was even truly formed, and from what I gathered, it primarily follows a female protagonist of a group called the Aurum, who is tasked with either protecting the entirety of the lands from evil, or just the mysterious white crystal that seems somewhat pivotal to their race. I can't exactly tell. On top of that, I haven't even fully grasped the protagonist's name, though I'm fairly certain it's Irene? Evidently, though, the story will be a lot clearer when the band actually decides to release lyrics for their tracks. So if you're looking for a full explanation of the concept, then you'll have to wait for that. Regardless, the fantasy feel in the concept is executed very well, and from what I can grasp of the tale told, it's quite interesting, so I won't spoil anything in that regards. I will, however, say that the band's prior material constitutes some of my favorite symphonic power metal that there is, and their first trilogy of albums is certainly one of my favorite sagas in all of metal. All of the band members are extremely talented on a technical level, and their music is quite incredible as far as I'm concerned. So far, they've mostly improved with each release, and I'm going to tentatively say that this album continues that trend. Getting into the actual musical performances on this thing, everything is basically top-notch. The guitars on this album are quite good, as usual for the band, some fairly impressive leads and rather technical solos on here, often with some neoclassical flares. There also appears to be a lot more of a melodeath sound on many of the leads and some of the solos on this thing, and I think they blend in quite well, but we'll get more to that later. There are some rather impressive riffs on this thing as well, and ultimately the guitars more than do their job with how stunning some of the melodies and solos are played on here. The bass on this album is also incredible, as is to be expected of the band, with some super impressive solos and some fairly interesting parts throughout pretty much the entirety of the album. Not much more to say other than that, it's extremely enjoyable as usual. Percussion on this album is even better than I expected, honestly. Lots of intricate, more technical and impressive passages punctuated by great fills and consistently great songwriting. Plus, with the more intense sections the sound tends to take, the percussion definitely helps in ramping things up heavily, which is quite a fun time. However, percussion isn't the only thing the band improved on with this album. The vocals on here are easily the best that I have heard from the band. Sarah's vocal performance is incredible on this thing. Absolutely great sense of emotion and tons of variety in her vocal styles throughout the album. Generally speaking, they're even more beautiful than usual, which is definitely saying something. Another cool thing is the increased use of harsh vocals on this thing, and compared to the band's previous releases, they are much more refined, feeling a lot more impactful and fitting than in previous attempts, which is greatly welcomed considering just how well they do in fact fit in. The keyboards and orchestrations on this thing are also quite good, some very interesting passages here, and like the vocals, they tend to give off some great emotion and are quite beautiful. There seems to be some slightly heavier use of them here than in previous albums, and considering how well it's all composed, it's definitely greatly welcomed. They definitely lend perfectly to the sound and create amazing additions to the atmosphere and feels of the songs. That, and there are some quality keyboard solos, which is always a good time. Though, of course, the top-notch musicianship on this album would be completely irrelevant if the songwriting weren't any good, and thankfully, Ancient Bards certainly don't have that issue with this album. The songwriting on this album is quite top tier, believe it or not. As mentioned earlier, there are an absolute ton of memorable melodies and leads on the guitars, vocals, orchestrals, and keyboards carrying most of them. The melody lines that often lace into each other are both very impressive and generally stunningly beautiful, with some great interwoven sections across all previously mentioned instruments, vocals included. As previously stated, they're all essentially ridiculously catchy and beautiful, with the exception of the more aggressive leads on this thing, particularly those that tend to shine through on the more intense sections. This album has much more of an aggressive edge to it than their previous three, in my opinion, which is greatly welcomed considering the more melodic death metal-esque leads that we get going on here. They juxtapose the inspiring, more neoclassical side of things quite well, and are a very good addition in my opinion. On top of that, the solos on this thing are pretty damn top tier, and we also get to see the Melodeath style used in tandem with them on here as well, which is quite appreciated. Ultimately, all the solos and melody lines are written quite amazingly and are generally extremely catchy at that. As for the riffs on this thing, they are pretty high quality. While not super frequent, considering this is symphonic power metal and all, there are more than one would expect, and they're all pretty fucking great at that. Not only do a solid amount of them hit with a surprising amount of intensity, but for the majority they are all super heckin' catchy as well. As mentioned with the melodies, a solid chunk of them have a more Melodeath feel too, which again is pretty fitting a decent portion of the time. Percussion fills, as previously stated, are pretty high quality as well, and it's got a decent amount of variety, intensity, and impact overall. Not to mention all the writing for the orchestration is top notch at that, fitting in very well with the other instrumentals. As for the actual song structures, the band definitely slots in some nice progressive structuring and timings for some of the songs on here, especially with that 15-minute closing track on this thing. And speaking of 15-minute closing tracks, guess which song on here is my favorite? That aside, the progressive implementations are pretty great and are present throughout a decent portion of the album. In the instances that they aren't, the song structuring is more along the lines of what you'd expect from standard power metal, and in such instances, the melodic aspects are so present that the structuring definitely helps keep the song stuck in your head. Ultimately, the songwriting is superb on this album, and I can't really see many downsides to it, if any, especially when they lead into the general atmosphere so well and give way to some great emotion. Speaking of the atmosphere on this album, it's quite adaptable, though generally works around the fantasy theme the band has going for it. There tends to be a very theatrical, mystifying feel to it, evidently blending in quite well with the music and leaving a sense of wonder. It generally shifts between aggression and beauty depending on the story, juxtaposing the two quite well overall. There are many instances where the more aggressive sections are built up with a more sinister or urgent atmosphere, and as such the more calming, beautiful sections and the inspiring, motivational highs that the atmosphere reaches definitely all work very well in tandem to display the emotions on this thing. In particular, many of the emotions the characters feel are displayed quite well in the music and atmosphere throughout the album. There are definitely times where I can absolutely feel the rage, sorrow, and joy throughout here, and it is quite a good time overall. I would also like to say that the production is pretty much spot on for the entire thing. Every instrument hits with great impact. I find that pretty much nothing is buried in the mix at all, and generally the more clean mix on this thing allows for all of the wonderful interwoven melodies to shine through perfectly. In particular, the orchestral matches and blends ridiculously well with everything else here, which is much appreciated. If I were to have any complaints here at all, it would probably be that the more melodic death metal-esque guitar lines could possibly hit with a bit more power, but ultimately it all seems to fit in quite well regardless. And now, before we move on to my final thoughts about the album, let us dive into the individual tracks, give some short overviews, and see what exactly this wonderful album is comprised of. So the first track we have on the album, Origine, is more of an introduction than anything, as is usual with the band's albums. The orchestral bits on this one, though, are generally better than what I would expect for a narrated intro, and are quite memorable and atmospheric, perfectly building into the next track. At that, the narration here is pretty well done, as the band now has a new, seemingly more official narrator, and his voice works really heckin' well here. Impious Dystopia is the following track, and no matter how many times I hear it, I can't get over how Sarah pronounces impious on this thing. That's probably my only complaint about the entire track, though, as everything else about it is stellar. It's your more straightforward opening track with some epic orchestral leading in, accompanied by operatic choir vocals, which ramp directly into some great blazing riffs and melodies, as well as Sarah's vocals, which are quite powerful here. We're almost immediately treated to some intense harsh vocals here as well, and of course the music shifts to match the aggressive intensity behind the harshes and the inspiring, beautiful intensity of Sarah's vocals, making the song almost feel like a grand duel between two massive powers in and of itself, which is seemingly exactly what it's meant to represent within the story, so yeah. The chorus here is genuinely beautiful, and the bridge, along with the harsh sections, are crushingly heavy. The bass solo on here is absolutely amazing as well, and followed by the guitar solo that's just as good. It's pretty spicy overall. The vocals on here are again quite stunning, solidifying this album as being one of Sarah's best performances in my opinion, and the song ends off on a high note as well, not letting up any of the intensity. The following song, Fantasy's Wings, is a lot less intense, instead choosing a more adventurous, wondrous route for the overall atmosphere. The entire song feels swathed in a childlike nostalgia that I personally find so pure and innocent, and it always brings up such good feels whenever I listen to it. The bridge is especially evocative of this, and it pretty much gives me shivers every time I listen to it. Ultimately, this song is a lot more focused on serenity, beauty, and a very, very upbeat, catchy, and joyful chorus. Certainly one of the catchier songs on the album, and definitely one of the ones that makes me the happiest listening to. The next song, Aurum Legacy, is more of a ballad-esque song, though is at more of a mid-tempo and still retains a decent amount of riffing and lead work to it. It definitely carries the atmosphere and emotion of a ballad, though, and as such I'm counting it as one. In which case, it's the best on the album. The vocals and orchestrals work really well together, especially with the rest of the instrumentals kicking in to add some intensity. The chorus here is beautiful as well, and once again there's some nice emotion carried through here overall. The leads are more intense than you'd expect, and quite catchy at that as well, which makes it a really good blend overall. The next song we have is another ballad, albeit much calmer, more down-tempo, and more serene. It's also probably one of the worst songs on the album, which is saying a lot considering how beautiful and catchy it is. It's pretty much devoid of any use of guitar, relying purely on Sarah's vocals and some orchestral and piano mix, along with percussion to add some sense of progression. Ultimately, it's a fairly standard ballad, even if it's done extremely well at that. So there's not too much else to say on that. Oscurita, the next track on the album, opens with a fairly slow, beautiful, yet ominous atmosphere, led on only by the spooky orchestral backing and Sarah's vocals, which I might say are ridiculously fucking good on the intro here. Definitely one of her most interesting performances on the album. The song then ramps up with some spicier, more intense riffing, the orchestral moving into a speedier tempo as the ominous feels only grow, especially when the harsh vocals come in. The chorus is quite beautiful, relatively catchy, and of course still carries that whole spooky, ominous atmosphere along with it, and the solo on here is pretty damn great, flowing with the rest of the song surprisingly well, and showing off some really nice technical flair along with some great melody. Overall, it's quite a good song, some nice intensity, and you definitely get the sense that something is not as it should be. The next song, Titanism, starts off with a much more frantic orchestral intro, carrying the intensity of the last song, but ramping it up even further with the riffing here. The choir-like operatic vocals are back in full force on here, and it is quite a good time. As mentioned, the riffing primarily carries the song, and does it really, really well. The chorus is also quite a ride on this thing, with the interlayering of literally every single vocal style used for some great impact, as well as Sarah's voice carrying through some nice anger afterwards. I also love the vocal line leading up to the chorus. It's pretty difficult to not sing along to it. The bridge here is pretty nice, though not extremely notable compared to the rest of the song, and overall the strength of this one definitely lies in the quality riffing, the intensity, the choir vocals, and the chorus overall. So yeah, pretty much all of it's really, really good. After that we get The Hollow, and aside from those same operatic choir vocals, this song is purely instrumental actually, and mostly orchestral at that. Despite it being over 3.5 minutes, it almost feels like it's more of an interlude, and in that sense, it definitely does not overstay its welcome, even considering its length. The orchestral sections are wonderfully inspiring and work great in tandem with the operatic choir vocals on here. Past that, when the guitar kicks in on this thing, it ramps the intensity up quite nicely, which works really well considering the vocals and percussion only get more urgent at that. That being said, the guitar line on here is super catchy as well, and rather impressive at that. So it's a really good time overall, and ridiculously strong for what's more of an instrumental track, all things considered. Immediately following it, we have the most intense song on the entire album, Home of the Rejects, which starts with some very intense riffing and some high-quality harsh vocals to take things to a peak before running into the verses. Overall, the riffing stays consistently heavy and aggressive on this thing. The tempo is quite high and fits with the aggressive feel, which is great. And with how catchy the chorus is, it has such a great ominous atmosphere overall. That and the bridge on this thing is pretty damn spicy, going into a more down-tempo, more mellow-deathy section, which works quite well before running into a relatively short guitar solo and kicking right back into the aggressive tempo from prior. The song ends off at quite a peak as well, the guitar lead finishing it off really, really nicely. And with that, we get taken into the final song, The Great Divide, also known as my favorite song on the album, as one would expect from a 15-minute epic of such caliber. It starts off slower and more calm, starting to build an atmosphere with the orchestral elements, which slowly build in intensity, particularly as the percussion rides in. It all eventually culminates into what is assuredly the best riff on the entire album so far as I am concerned. One that is ridiculously catchy, inspirational, and intense all at once. It leads into the first verse, where Sarah takes the reins with some very motivational and determined vocal work, which leads into even more great and unique riffing, as well as some wonderful choir-like vocals layered atop, before returning to that godly opening riff running through the verse again. This runs on before the song slows down, all instruments except for the orchestration dropping away as it bleeds into what is essentially the sole most beautiful section of the entire album as far as I'm concerned, with Sarah's operatic vocals rising in and just dripping with beautiful emotion. The serene orchestrals then slowly swelling as the choir vocals come back in, culminating in some more absolutely beautiful melodies as the riffs finally return, bringing us back on track for a very quality yet fairly short guitar solo before we get led directly into some much more intense riffing and more harsh vocals, with an extremely ominous atmosphere now shrouding the entire song. Furthermore, the percussion at this point is ridiculously intense, and ultimately I'd say that this is probably the heaviest bit on the album here. This band definitely did not pull any punches with this song, I would say. It then goes into some more intense choir vocals before returning to Sarah, her voice renewed with resolve as she trades off in a battle with the harsh vocals, evidently signifying the final conflict and doing it absolutely fucking amazingly. It shifts to some more inspirational vocal lines from Sarah before heading into another solo, this one much more prolonged and much more impressive at that, making for a wonderful finish as things calm back down, the orchestral taking over once more. The song finishes with more expositional narration, and at this point it fits in extremely well with the orchestrals and works perfectly in tandem with them, especially considering how high quality their new narrator is. The song ends off with some extremely fitting orchestral flair, making a beautiful closing for the album as a whole and leaving some definite intrigue into what might happen next as far as the storyline goes. Certainly a glorious track, even if you don't agree with me that it's the best here. Ultimately, what we have here is a rather stunning piece of symphonic power metal, brought to us by what I would definitely say is one of the better modern bands in the respective genre. Considering it's their best album in my eyes, it's certainly nothing to be looked down upon. The riffs are top tier, the melodies are godly, and the songwriting overall is quite amazing. Combine that with the incredible musicianship from the band alongside the wonderful emotion and atmosphere that this music evokes, and you have nearly a perfect combination of elements. Considering that on top of all of this, half the tracks on this album are basically perfect, and the rest are nearly there for the most part, I can be pretty confident in my decision that this album deserves a 10 out of 10. Again, not perfect, mind you. If I had to give an exact calculation, I'd say this slides closer to like a 96 or 97%. But considering we're on a scale of 10s here, that's the most fitting ranking I can give the boy. I would highly recommend it to anyone that is a fan of many things, I guess. Power metal, symphonic power metal with melodeath implementations, glorious long-ass closing tracks, like myself, Rhapsody of Fire, also like myself, and yeah, etc., many more. Ultimately, it's an amazing album. So, yeah, 10 out of 10 album. First one of the year that I've listened to as well. If I'm going to be honest, I kind of expected it to be as such. Maybe I didn't exactly expect it to be as good as it was, but I definitely expected it to be better than their last album. Either that or I expected it to be worse than all of their albums. So yeah, two extremes, and I'm glad that it was the positive side of things. Either way, if you liked the review as well as my voice, I guess, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really liked it, then subscribe to the channel for more reviews, as well as some cool as heck metal recaps, which will keep you up to date with all the spiciest releases per month. I also do covers on occasion, though not too well, honestly. If you have any suggestions for future reviews, go ahead and hit up the comments. Or if you want to discuss the album, then leave a comment, and I'll definitely respond since I love discussion. But yeah, that's essentially all. I have been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you for watching.